Okay. Ne- Next topic is how we can deploy the Kubernetes cluster. There are multiple ways you can deploy it. One of them is Minikube. Using the Minikube, you can deploy in your home lab, but you need some kind of virtualized software like VMware Workstation, VirtualBox, or Docker or Hyper-V to deploy using Minikube. But that is for testing purpose only. Other way is using kubeadm tool. Okay, using kubeadm, that is a command line tool. You can deploy the Kubernetes cluster. That is a production grade cluster. You can deploy it. If you don't want to deploy it, you are using some kind of cloud solution. All the cloud provider provide the pre-deployed Kubernetes cluster where master they will control. You will get the worker node and the API access. Google also provide Google Kubernetes engine. Same way AWS provide. Same way Microsoft Azure provide. So all these guys provided the Kubernetes engine. Okay, pre-deployed environment. We in this training we will be using kubeadm tool. We will have Ubuntu 22.04 server for deployment, and we will be installing the single master node only. Okay, and we will use the kubeadm tool. So agenda for this, what is kubeadm? We'll understand. We'll use the kubeadm tool to create the cluster and then configure the cluster. We'll see kubeadm init command and kubeadm join command. Okay, so what is kubeadm? kubeadm is a tool that can be used to build a minimal viable Kubernetes production grade cluster. First of all, this is important. This is a production grade cluster where all the things are equivalent to the what's supposed to be in a production Kubernetes cluster. Using kubeadm, you can deploy the best practices which is required for Kubernetes cluster. A simple way to deploy the Kubernetes, okay, and a way for existing user to automating setting of the cluster and test their application. kubeadm, first of all, why I am telling production grade cluster? It is you create a full PKI setup. What is PKI? Public key infrastructure. So all the communication between the services or all the communication from the user to the API server, everything is encrypted. And that's the reason it is provide a full production grade production equivalent setup. It's a built-up tool, provide kubeadm init and kubeadm join command. These two commands we use it for fast path for creating the cluster. What is kubeadm init? So whenever I want to deploy a new Kubernetes cluster on the node, I will run the command kubeadm init command. It will create the master on that particular node. Okay. So kubeadm init bootstraps a Kubernetes control plane node by executing the following. Control plane in the sense the master node is run the pre-flight checks to validate the system start before making the changes. Okay, so it will check it out that okay, everything is proper, the SAP is off or not, container runtime is there or not, all this thing kubelet is installed or not, because basically kubelet is a service, it is going to use it to deploy the static pods. Okay, it generates a self-signed CA to set up the identity for each component in the cluster. So user can own their own CA as well, but it's good to have self-signed CA because that is what to use. Writes kubeconfig file into etc kubernetes folder and for the kubelet. The controller as a scheduler to use to connect the API server, each with its own identity. Okay, as well as additional kubeconfig file for the administrator name admin.conf. Okay, so basically configuration file be created. Okay, generates a static pod. Okay, so basically all the components etcd, API server, scheduler, manager, everything will be deployed in the pod format, static pod. So basically kubelet will go to the static location where all the YAML file be there, and they will kubelet will read that static location. That's why it is called a static pod. It is not deployed through the master, it will be using the kubelet service to deploy it. Okay, so basically if you are not using the external etcd server, better to create the static pod for etcd as well. Static pod manifestors are by default written etc kubernetes manifest location only. Kubelet watch that directory and it will create the pod. Okay, applied labels and tend to the control plane node, so the no additional workload will run. So master by default will not able to run because the taint is there, it will not allow to run anything there. Generates the token that the additional node you can register it to the control plane. Okay, makes all the necessary configuration to allow to joining with the bootstrap tokens and TLS token mechanism. Okay. Same way it writes the config maps, which we will discuss it, and RBOK rules. So all this thing is there, and the DNS and proxy, everything will be there. So once you set up the environment, you need to install the container network interface CNI. Final, we will be using it. Okay. And when we will discuss the networking, we will discuss it in detail. But because since we are deploying the Kubernetes master components in the pod format, we need to set up the network interface as well. Now kubeadm join command. It is used to add the worker node to the existing Kubernetes cluster. Whenever you initially set up the cluster, you need to run the kubeadm init command on the control plane. It generates the unique token that required for the worker node to join it. So kubeadm a join and then token and then give the token ID and the port number. Okay, and definitely CA certs also you need to provide it. After executing the kubeadm join command, the worker node will be establish a connection to the control plane. It will download the necessary components and dependency to become the part of that Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so that is all about kubeadm tool. Okay, and we already have performed the lab, and all the things I have shared in my Git repo as well. Okay, so you guys can later on perform the lab. So the lab is okay. I'll just give you the overview as well. What is the lab? You have to do it. So first you need to configure the Docker runtime. Okay. Then we are enabling the bridge network for IPv4 and IPv6. And then we are setting up the Kubernetes repo and installing the Kubernetes, kubeadm, kubelet, and kubectl. Then running the kubeadm init command. Okay. And here we are setting up the final CNI. Okay. These are the steps you need to perform it out. Thank you.